All Bones Considered Laurel Hill Stories bonus episode for January 2025. Happy 200th birthday to Richard Henry Rush, 1825-1893, from West Point to the Lancers. The script was written by fellow Laurel Hill guide Russ Dodge, whose military knowledge is staggering. He declined the opportunity to record it himself. Plan to go on one of his tours when you have the chance, though. You will always learn something. In 1861, the United States raised dozens of regiments of infantry and cavalry to meet the crisis that began when the secessionist states that formed the nascent Confederate States of America fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, and started the long, simmering American Civil War. The small cadre of West Point-educated professional officers were needed to train the thousands of volunteer citizen soldiers and officers. Of the many cavalry regiments raised in the early days, none would be more unique and famous than the 6th Pennsylvania Volunteer Cavalry, which gained the nickname Rush's Lancers due to them being issued and trained with European-style cavalry lances. This came about from the relationship between two West Point classmates, Army of the Potomac commander, Major General George B. McClellan, and the regiment's first leader, Laurel Hill East Cemetery resident, Colonel Richard Henry Rush. Richard Henry Rush, buried in Section P, Lot 37 of Laurel Hill East Cemetery, was born January 14, 1825, in London, England, the latest in a family line of famous American patriots. His grandfather was Dr. Benjamin Rush, preeminent physician of the Revolutionary War, who'd been elected as a delegate to the Continental Congress. He voted for American independence from England and signed the Declaration of Independence. Post-war, Benjamin became a staunch champion for the humane treatment of the mentally ill and the removal of social stigma for the illness. Benjamin's son, Richard Rush, father of Colonel Rush, was a lawyer of great standing and a much sought-after legal mind. He served as Pennsylvania's Attorney General in 1811, then as United States Attorney General in the second administration of President James Madison from 1814 to 1817. He was then appointed by newly elected President James Monroe to be the United States Minister to England, a post that he held for 8 years. It was during Richard's time in the court of St. James's that Richard Henry Rush was born. The future 6th Pennsylvania commander's life in England would not last long, because when John Quincy Adams was elected 6th United States President in 1824, the elder Rush was recalled from his diplomatic post to serve as the Secretary of the Treasury. Young Richard Henry split time in his youth and teens living in Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia, while he experienced his father's vice presidential candidacy when John Quincy Adams ran for a second term in 1828, and the ticket was defeated by Andrew Jackson. At age 16, Richard Henry's father had so many political contacts that it made it easy for him to gain an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York in 1842. In July 1846, he graduated 26th out of a class of 59. Among his classmates, future Civil War generals such as George B. McClellan, Darius N. Couch, Jesse L. Reno, and George Stoneman on the Union side. On the Confederate side, there was Thomas J. Jackson. You probably know him better as Stonewall Jackson, George E. Pickett, and Cadmus M. Wilcox. Richard Henry Rush was posted to the artillery, and he served in that branch for 8 years. He saw service and combat in the Mexican War, received a promotion to first lieutenant, and continued to forge a friendship with his former classmate George McClellan. But in 1854, he resigned his commission for reasons that were unrecorded, but likely stemmed from the glacial pace of promotions in the peacetime regular army. When the Civil War began, like many former Army officers, Richard sought to do his duty to aid putting down the rebellion. He wrote to Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin and sought a brigadier generalcy in the Pennsylvania state forces and command of the state's artillery. His request was denied. So he sought permission to raise a light artillery battery, but that was also turned down. Frustrated by the lack of opportunities to defend the Union with his home state, he offered his services in any capacity to the federal government as a West Point graduate, and the federal government denied his request. Shut out of a commission, Richard turned to a family friend, financier Clement Biddle Barclay, who held some influence in the governor's mansion. He served as Governor Curtin's unofficial aide. Barclay persuaded the governor to authorize the raising of a cavalry regiment, with Richard Henry Rush as its colonel and commander. At age 37, he was back in the service of his country. He started recruitment at once, and as men trickled in to join, Richard had already selected nearly all of his officers. He was a shrewd judge of military talent, and the men that he picked would more than justify his faith in them to do the job. Colonel Rush led a highly successful drive through newspaper ads and posted broadsides that touted bonuses and pay while they exhorted potential enlistees to do their duty to save the Union. By September 1861, the regiment had nearly 1,000 officers and men in training at Camp Meigs. Camp Meigs was located in the Nicetown section of Philadelphia. In the middle of October, the unit received their complement of arms, and at the end of October they were given their colors in an elaborate ceremony that officially inducted the regiment into the Federal Army with the designation of 6th Pennsylvania Volunteer Cavalry. As Colonel Rush prepared his men for deployment in Washington, D.C., he was contacted by his old West Point friend George McClellan, who at this time was Major General McClellan, in command of what he designated the Army of the Potomac. McClellan's operational philosophy of war was heavily influenced by Napoleonic and European war tactics, which he greatly admired. Indeed, the Napoleonic way of war was taught to all West Point graduates up to the Civil War. McClellan was also further influenced by his time as a military observer in the Crimean War, and he lamented there were no Lancer regiments being raised in the United States. A staple of European cavalry for centuries, a cavalry lance generally was about 8 to 9 feet long. The lances were used by elite units in Europe in charges on lines of infantry or infantry squares, often to great effect. General McClellan desired a lancer unit in the growing Union Army, and when he heard that his friend and classmate was in charge of a Pennsylvania cavalry regiment, he offered that honor to Colonel Rush, who readily accepted. And by November 30th, 1861, the 6th Pennsylvania had received 9-foot-long wooden lances tipped with steel. The troops started to drill immediately with the lances. The new weapons proved to be awkward and unwieldy, especially in the woodlands and the rocky terrain that made up much of the eastern United States. Still, the lances set the 6th Pennsylvania apart from all other cavalry regiments in either army, and that instilled a sense of camaraderie and esprit de corps among the men. Crowds gathered at Camp Meigs to watch the men drill with such unique arms. They were soon referred to as the Lancers of Colonel Rush, which was then shortened, and Rush's Lancers was born. After a grand review in mid-December by Governor Curtin and dignitaries, Colonel Richard Henry Rush and his Lancers finally headed to Washington, D.C. to join the Army of the Potomac. When he arrived in the capital, Colonel Rush was directed to occupy a camp at Meridian Hill that had previously been used by another cavalry regiment. Here, drill continued under his tutelage with the Lancers, which again brought crowds to watch, just like back in Philadelphia. Colonel Rush's efforts in creating the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry yielded unexpected dividends. For a cavalry with lances to be effective, the men had to be proficient in working together as one unit. And the lance training made them work harder in that area than most other cavalry regiments. And by the time the regiment was reviewed by the Army of the Potomac's Chief of Cavalry, Brigadier General George Stoneman, another West Point classmate of Richard Henry Rush, they were reviewed at the end of December 1861. They were declared ready for battle, ready to take the field. Rush's tough but fair drilling had made the Lancers a highly disciplined force. February 6, 1862, the non-commissioned officers showed the esteem they held for their commander when they presented Colonel Rush with a fine ceremonial sword accompanied by speeches honoring him. The sword was inscribed with the words, "Presented to Colonel R.H. Rush of the Philadelphia Light Cavalry by the non-commissioned officers of his regiment." When he accepted this honor, Colonel Rush made remarks praising his non-commissioned officers, whom he said were held with more esteem than commissioned officers of other cavalry units. As the bitter winter finally broke in March 1862, plans were being made to finally move the Army of the Potomac out of their winter quarters in Washington, D.C., and to march on Richmond and the defending Confederate Army under General Joseph E. Johnston. Rush's Lancers arrived in Hampton, Virginia by ship on April 9th. Colonel Rush and his men were assigned as the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Reserve and placed in the command of Brigadier General William H. Emory, whose brigade consisted of the professional soldiers of 5th and 6th United States Cavalry regiments of the regular Army. Well, they were fortunate to be paired with regular Army troops in terms of continuing their education as soldiers, but the regulars didn't really take warmly to Colonel Rush and his men. The professionals immediately complained that while the men Richard Henry Rush commanded looked fine on the parade grounds with their impressive-looking lances, they knew that in actual combat, those lances would be unwieldy. They would be virtually useless. Now, the Lancers had not chosen to be armed with those now seemingly anachronistic weapons, but they resented the mocking of the regulars. Complaints also started to filter out about a change in attitude the men felt about their commander. West Point graduate Rush drilled, rode, and disciplined his men hard. During training, it was necessary to turn civilian volunteers into soldiers. As they were about to join their first foray against the rebels, Colonel Rush continued to be a hard disciplinarian. An officer of an infantry regiment who is a relative of Colonel Rush reported, "I hear constant complaints of treatment which nothing can sanction, and I fear he's raised bitterness which operates against him." Still, the men went into their field command confident of the soldierly abilities Colonel Rush had drilled and trained into them. The Peninsula Campaign to capture Richmond, in which McClellan landed his huge army on the Virginia Peninsula to march northwest to Richmond, began in May. Colonel Rush finally had a chance to lead his men in battle and prove their worth. They were held in reserve during the fierce May 6, 1862 Battle of Williamsburg, but many wrote home about being shocked by the carnage of the battle. The Lancers moved northwest, and on May 27, 1862, Rush got his first taste of command in combat at Hanover Courthouse. About 12,000 Union troops encountered around 4,000 Confederates, who initially made a stand and inflicted high casualties on the lead Federal regiments. But the rebels ultimately broke under the weight of superior numbers. Colonel Rush's men performed well and took a good number of Confederate troops prisoner. They chased down a number of rebels. They captured them at the point of their lances. A correspondent from the Philadelphia Inquirer reported their performance. Quote, "They went into action with the coolness and steadiness of veteran troops, and at a critical moment of the day, when cavalry was ordered to charge, joining the regulars, they rode solidly and fearlessly down on an overwhelming force of rebels under a galling fire and scattered them like sheep." Praise for Rush and his men also came from 5th Corps Commander, Major General Fitzjohn Porter. Despite their success with the lances in a relatively small action, the men of the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry found out firsthand how cumbersome the weapons were. Many sent complaints home in letters to their families. For all the training instilled by Colonel Rush, the realities of mid-19th century combat proved that the lances were a relic of the Napoleonic Wars. Between the action at Hanover Courthouse and their next-pitched clash at the Battle of Glendale, Rush directed his men in scouting duties, which led to frequent skirmishes with the rebels and destruction of bridges, boats, buildings, and other Confederate assets. They also rounded up a number of Confederates, adding to their total since the first action in May, and they tangled with the cavalry under Confederate General J.E.B. Stuart. Rush also lost a few of his own men as prisoners to the Confederates. Finally, June 27, 1862, after 2 months of scouting and skirmishing, Colonel Richard Henry Rush led his regiment into their first major combat at Glendale, Virginia. Posted on the left flank of the Army of the Potomac arrayed against the Confederates, the entire flank began to crumble at the assaults by the rebel army. Ordered by Cavalry Reserve Commander General Philip St. George Cocke to charge into the attacking Confederates, the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry and the 1st and 5th U.S. Cavalry Regulars pitched into the rebels, which blunted the attack and allowed the remnants of the 5th Corps to retire from the field safely. Colonel Rush and General Cocke praised the men in their after-action report, but General Porter unfairly accused them of failing to hold the left flank and accused some of the Lancers of cowardice for breaking when their charge was spent. Philadelphia news correspondents refuted General Porter's accusations in print. Aided by General McClellan's own indecisiveness and fearful belief that he was outnumbered, General Robert E. Lee successfully kept the Union Army away from Richmond. Colonel Rush led his men back to Fortress Monroe in Hampton, their starting point from last April, and there they stayed until returning to Washington, D.C. in August 1862. The next month, September 1862, General Lee took the Army of Northern Virginia over the Potomac and invaded Maryland. He hoped to take the fighting out of war-ravaged Virginia and to induce Marylanders to join the Confederacy. General McClellan made his pursuit with his army, which resulted in the clash at the South Mountain on September 14th and the monumental September 17th Battle of Antietam. By this time, Rush's Lancers had built a reputation for hard fighting and good service, and Colonel Rush had several companies detached from his regiment to serve as headquarter guards. 3 companies that were attached to the 6th Corps headquarters scouted around Crampton's Gap at South Mountain while fighting raged. Colonel Rush and his men were held in reserve as artillery crashed around them. They were detailed to support 5th Corps artillery batteries, a duty that displeased Cavalry Artillery Commander Colonel John C. Tidball, who stated that horsemen armed with lances would be wholly ineffective in protecting artillery. They should be armed with proper carbines instead. Still, Colonel Rush held his men against the return fire the batteries incurred. Later in the battle, they were part of a cavalry charge across what was dubbed the Middle Bridge over Antietam Creek, as Colonel Rush led his men to the Confederate side and drove away the rebel artillery. They later protected the Army's flanks. Consensus of the day was that McClellan wholly misused his horsemen. Still, the battle was a tactical stalemate, but a strategic win for the Federals. From September to November, the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry remained with the rest of the Army in Maryland, scouting and skirmishing. In October, General J.E.B. Stuart and his command decided to ride around the Union Army and repeat the same sort of mischief as they had successfully done in May. Rush got word of Stuart's presence in Pennsylvania, and he took off after him. He split his unit to cover more ground. Near Gettysburg, the future site of the war's most monumental battle, most of the Lancers were almost captured when Stuart's raiders surprised them. Only the arrival of a contingent led by Rush himself saved his troopers from a rebel prison camp. The Lancers shadowed Stuart's troops and sent intelligence reports back to the headquarters. Cavalry Commander General Alfred Pleasanton and General McClellan failed to act on Colonel Rush's and other reports, and General Stuart completed his humiliation ride around the Union Army. November 1862, General McClellan was replaced by Major General Ambrose E. Burnside as commander of the Army of the Potomac. Burnside was prodded into action that McClellan would not take. The result was the December 1862 Fredericksburg campaign. Burnside brought his army to the banks of the Rappahannock River across from Fredericksburg, Virginia, captured the town in heavy street fighting after a highly contested river crossing, and was set to attack the near impregnable Confederate positions west of the town on Mary's Heights. Colonel Rush's command guarded the bridge below Fredericksburg, gathered prisoners as they were sent from the battle, and worked as provost guard for their regiment as the infantry made 4 brutal, bloody, and futile charges against the rebels on Mary's Heights. Rush's troops witnessed the carnage, but they avoided it, and the Union Army suffered a stinging defeat. They would encamp with the rest of the battered army in their winter quarters along the Rappahannock near Fredericksburg until spring. January 1863, Burnside's replaced by Major General Joseph Hooker as Army commander. This move breathed life into an army whose morale had sunk dangerously low after the Fredericksburg disaster. Hooker reorganized the army. He instituted furloughs, distributed regular pay, and inaugurated competition for the best drilled units. Hooker also consolidated the Army of the Potomac's cavalry into a 12,000-strong separate corps after the brigades had been distributed throughout the army. The corps commander was Major General George Stoneman, Rush's old classmate from West Point. Stoneman reviewed the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry, which had drilled constantly when elements were not on patrol or on guard duty, and declared it the finest regiment in the cavalry service. Near the end of March 1863, Colonel Rush was absent from the unit while he served as inspector of artillery. He drew on his 8-year experience in that fighting army before the Civil War. April 6, 1863, President and Mrs. Lincoln visited the Army, which prompted a grand review of the troops for their commander-in-chief. A few weeks previously, the Lancers were made part of Brigadier General John Buford's Reserve Brigade, and again were brigaded with regular Army cavalry regiments. But this time, the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry were treated with much more respect. During the cavalry presentation for the President and the First Lady, Colonel Rush and his men brought up the rear of the brigade. With Colonel Rush at its head, the Lancers were, quote, presenting a perfect picture-like effect in beautiful order, noted an infantry officer. With precision movements born from Colonel Rush's constant drilling, with red regimental pennons fluttering in the breeze, their lances looking intimidating, many observers were impressed. A soldier from New York wrote home, "They were a fine sight, and their subsequent movements proved them to be finely drilled." They had gone from being laughed at for their elitist-looking weapons and unskilled cavalry ways to being roundly praised for the martial bearing and precision in movements. Colonel Richard Henry Rush had successfully turned his Philadelphia citizen volunteers into one of the finest cavalry units in the Army. During the 1863 spring campaign, Hooker planned to steal the march on the Confederates on the other side of the Rappahannock, get in their rear, and attack. A campaign that would result in the three-day Battle of Chancellorsville in early May. Colonel Rush led his men out of camp on April 13th. They were assigned to special duty by General Stoneman. Their task, rapidly move towards Richmond, destroy bridges, telegraph wires, railroad tracks, and canals along the way, take any Confederates you come across as prisoners. All the while, you will be distracting the Confederates. And Hooker is moving his army elsewhere. The brigade of General Buford crossed over the Rappahannock River at Kelly's Ford and encountered stout resistance by the Confederates, which halted the march and alerted the rebels of the operation. To make matters worse, Colonel Rush and his men were trapped against the river as a driving storm came up, and the river rose more than 7 feet in just hours. The wind and rain lasted for several days. It made life miserable for the Union soldiers and their mounts. Colonel Rush was detailed to send 2 separate companies out to pursue Confederate guerrillas and to perform reconnaissance around Warrenton, Virginia. So men of the first squad gave chase to rebels they encountered, but they did not catch any. Hooker's plans had been altered by the weather. He instructed Stoneman to divide the command, send the 2 elements in different directions, cut Confederate communications, and, in Hooker's words, quote, inflict a great deal of mischief, end quote. But no one could move until the rain stopped. And on April 25th, Colonel Richard Henry Rush took sick leave of the regiment he had molded into a fighting force that respected him but did not love him, especially since he was leaving while they were mired in the mud. Ostensibly, he was only going to take 20 days of sick leave. But Rush never returned to lead the men, and he would never see field service again. Richard Henry Rush could no longer serve in the field. The harsh, wet elements had reactivated the malaria he had caught during the Mexican War. In his request for leave, he wrote, "I am mortified that I have not the physical endurance to retain my health under the vicissitudes of our cavalry campaign." In a regimental review on April 27th, he expressed great regret that his health would not let him campaign due to his illness. He bade farewell to the regiment, and he returned to Washington, D.C. Colonel Rush continued to render service to his nation to the cause of defeating the rebellion. May 10th, 1863, he was detailed to the Provost Marshal's Bureau, helped organize what would become the Veterans Reserve Corps, also known as the Invalid Corps, the Invalids. Soldiers who were disabled or infirm from field service, but who could still serve on the home front, acting as garrison troops, prison guards, or special duty in Washington, D.C. Colonel Rush resigned his volunteer cavalry commission September 29, 1863, and was mustered in as colonel of the 1st Veteran Reserve Corps. He was assigned as commandant of Rock Island Prison in Illinois, and he served there in November-December of 1863. He finally resigned his Army commission for good July 1st, 1864. His post-war life was quiet. It was uneventful. He shied away from veteran reunions. He was not active in veteran affairs like many of his fellow Civil War soldiers. He had married before the war, 1851. He had 1 child, but his wife died. He remarried in 1856, and he raised 5 more children. In the 1880 United States Census, his occupation was listed as U.S. Army, despite not having been active duty for 16 years. He died in Philadelphia, in his home on Pine Street, on October 16, 1893. He was interred at Laurel Hill East, joining his father and other members in the family plot. The regiment he led carried the moniker of Rush's Lancers to the end and beyond, a telling evidence of his legacy. Happy 200th birthday, Richard Henry Rush.